I claim in this article, and to be fair, I've been making similar claims for the last couple of years, that the European Union has ended up in an existential crisis. That is, it's got to the point now where the very existence of the European Union in its current form is being brought into question by a series of unfortunate events, if you want to call it that, although if I'm being less courteous, I would say it's largely, if not completely, of their own making.
Hello, I'm Jasmine Birtles and welcome to the Tin Hat Money podcast. Now, today I'm joined by a former managing director of Lehman Brothers and Deutsche Bank and current investment director at Southbank Investments, my friend John Butler. Hello, John.
Hi, Jasmine.
Hello. So, John, I'm just going to go straight in because anybody who's read your articles, Fortune and Freedom, any of the investment newsletters that Southbank sends out, will know that you've written quite a lot about Europe. In fact, you lived for 5 years in Germany. So you have a particular view on what's happening economically and financially in the Eurozone and particularly in Germany. And a recent article that you came out with painted really quite a worrying picture. What do you think is the situation in Europe, and how can it affect the rest of us?
Well, I claim in this article, and to be fair, I've been making similar claims for the last couple of years, that the European Union has ended up in an existential crisis. That is, it's got to the point now where the very existence of the European Union in its current form is being brought into question by a series of unfortunate events, if you want to call it that, although if I'm being less courteous, I would say it's largely, if not completely, of their own making. And this is both economic and political. Those naturally overlap a lot. But you're seeing now from the Atlantic all the way to the eastern border of the European Union, this growing populist movement, populist pushback against Brussels, against the European Commission, which seems to regard itself as almost, and this is their own fault, almost unaccountable in some ways, as if the hoi polloi of the populism is undemocratic somehow, is illegitimate, and that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And Germany, of course, is the economic heart of the EU, and the fact that it's even happening in Germany itself, this is by far the single biggest net payer into the EU budget, is of, again, existential significance for the EU.
Yeah, the word Nazi is bandied about quite a lot at the moment, particularly when referring to the more right-wing parties. They're not described as right-wing, they're always described as far right, as you say, populist. Nazi is used, though never to do with Ukraine, I notice. What is this resurgence? It seems like a big, as you say, sort of populist movement against Brussels. Is it because they're fed up, or is there some weird thing that's making everybody suddenly turn right wing?
You actually look at some things that have happened recently in Europe, and Germans start to look at it and they start to see these weird historical parallels with some of the bad side of what happened in the 20th century. So they desperately want to be good Germans, not bad Germans. They desperately want to be good Europeans, not bad Europeans. But when Europe itself is making policy choices that are starting to look undemocratic, that are starting to look very heavy-handed, very top-down, very, God, let's not say this word too much, Nazi, Germans really get conflicted and confused. That's where we currently are.
So in terms of economics, what does this mean? Because as we know, Europe is particularly anemic economically. I mean, it seems to be worse than the UK, and we're struggling, certainly worse than America. There are all sorts of issues with huge amounts of debt from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, etc. And at the same time, they're still, as you say, pushing various policies that seem to be actually harmful. So, what does this mean for the global economics? Could it collapse and pull us all down with it?
Look, Germany is an important part of the global economy. It does carry the EU. It effectively, if indirectly, underwrites EU government debt, EU financial system debt, and of course, whatever the ECB chooses to do within that European financial system. It all comes down to trust and confidence in the fundamental sustainable health of the German economy. That is now coming into question. And indeed, as I mentioned a moment ago on more political matters, when it comes to Germany's economic existence, you're starting to see some very serious questions asked. Germans are not known for mincing words. And when the German finance ministry comes out and warns the government that the current trajectory of public finances, according to what is seen as a so-called worst case scenario, but is nevertheless officially published, they're basically saying that Germany is going to end up in a debt trap, and someday it's going to be unable to service that debt. That includes all the contingent liabilities that I referred to a moment ago. That is, that Germany effectively underwrites, if indirectly, the whole EU's debt, right, at all levels in some way. That's a big deal. And I think Germany is really having a look in the mirror now, a proper national look in the mirror, both politically and economically. Now, if Germany cannot keep its economic house in order, the EU is finished. No one else is going to carry it forward. The euro will fail eventually. No one else will be able to support that going forward. And yes, the global economy will suffer if the world's once upon a time leading exporting nation, as a proportion of its gross national product, underperforms chronically going forward. We will all lose out, as it were, because we've all benefited from this European economic dynamo that previously simply went from strength to strength following the Second World War.
And Germany's also got other problems economically, hasn't it? From its desperate need for net zero. I mean, you know, it's just extraordinary, it seems to me, what they've done to themselves in terms of their energy production.
Yes, I mean, the metaphor that people frequently use for this sort of thing is shooting oneself in the foot. I think Germany has deliberately walked through a minefield, right? It's that bad. And the war in Ukraine, oddly enough, only breaks out after it was becoming clear that Germany was failing to deliver in an effective way on its development of so-called green and renewable power. The wind generation, the solar generation were already beginning to demonstrate that they were not delivering on their promises. So Germany's energy policy was already showing signs of failure before the war breaks out. Then, of course, the war does break out, and Germany's dependence on abundant and affordable Russian gas is exposed for all the world to see. The Nord Stream pipelines, as we know, were spectacularly blown up, and I'm not going to speculate on who did that, although we all are entitled to our opinion. But that leaves Germany's export machine severely, if not completely crippled. Think about it. Germany was a margin business. They imported cheap energy and they imported cheap raw materials, not only from Russia, but from all over the world. They then processed that through their well-oiled manufacturing machine and exported to the world and captured the margin and did very, very well for themselves. Again, decade after decade, from strength to strength. What a success story. That will not come back without very, very fundamental political and economic reorientation on the part of the German leadership. Germany's being failed by its leaders now. I mean, they're doing such a bad job. I'm from California originally. They're doing almost as bad as California is doing. Now, how
Wow.
does a state or a country go from a hero to zero in a
Yeah.
single generation? You really have to try pretty hard to accomplish that now, don't you? Sadly, and again, but the Germans are at least they're starting to be honest with themselves about this. And I have a fair bit of faith that they will begin to realize that they really have to reorient now if they're going to survive, if the EU is going to survive, because it requires them to do so, and if the Euro project will survive.
So what do you think we're going to be seeing in the next year or two? Is it going to be probably, you know, a continuation of what seems to be a slow decline, or could it just jump off a cliff, frankly? Could there be something from left field that comes in and means, whoa, you know, end of the game?
Well, look, I mean, if the Ukraine war expands for whatever reason, all bets are off, and I don't want to go there. It's almost too horrible to contemplate. Let's assume that the Ukraine war gradually, if not suddenly, winds down rather than escalates. I think Germany has reached a point now where, again, looking in the mirror, they realize that what's happening is existential for Europe and for themselves. I think that Germany will, and this will not happen all at once, I believe it will happen incrementally. Germany will fundamentally renegotiate its relationship with the European Union. It is going to require other EU member countries to come to terms with their own various versions of fiscal profligacy, irresponsibility, lack of transparent accounting, corrupt business practices. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Germany's perfect. I'm not saying that for a second. But other factors equal, again, Germany is carrying the EU. I believe that what's going to happen is not dissimilar to what might happen if Trump ends up in the US White House again, because Trump will want to renegotiate the United States' relationship with NATO. Other NATO members will have to start carrying their own weight, providing for their own defense as part of the collective. Germany, I believe going forward, will have a very similar attitude towards the EU. The rest of the EU is going to have to demonstrate that they are worthy of being in the club, that they can sort themselves out and help to reform and restructure the EU and the European Central Bank as it pertains to the European and Euro monetary system. If Germany is unable to do that, and I don't think that it will come to this, if they're unable to convince their EU partners to play ball in that regard, eventually Germany will give up and they will try something else. But I don't think it will come to that.
Interesting. Well, we're going to have to just see, aren't we? Because it seems to be changing every day, every week. There's something new happening with the EU, which is each time slightly more worrying. But it'll be very interesting to see, particularly with the coming political upheavals and the elections. We've got elections all over Europe. John,
And the European elections themselves in June, right?
exactly.
Um, that could really be historic because you're going to see an incredibly big shift in the European Parliament, where to the point where the European Parliament may have such a large representation of right, far right, call it whatever you want, parties that are generally Eurosceptical parties that the EU Commission and the European Parliament will be at loggerheads for the first time ever in
Yeah.
the history of the EU. That's historic. And that may also provide an interesting European fig leaf for Germany to get even more assertive, trying to redefine its relationship with the EU going forward.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very interesting. John, thank you so much for talking us through what the situation is in the EU, and particularly with Germany. Really, really helpful. I'm going to get you on the programme again later in the year when we can look back and see what's happened so far. Thank you, John Butler from Southbank Investments. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like it and definitely share it and subscribe to the channel. We've got lots more like this coming along.